All right, good afternoon, Civics students. This is a lecture for Wednesday, um, what is it, April 22nd. So we're shifting gears a bit. You guys are still working on your legal brief on Planned Parenthood versus Casey, but we're going to proceed with, we looked at governmental institutions, Congress, presidency, and the Supreme Court. And now we're going to kind of move away from strictly governmental institutions of politics and looking at non-governmental institutions. And the first one we're going to look at are political parties. And one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of do it this way is that there's some big questions to kind of ponder as to, how do we pull off a representative democracy, which is another way of saying a republic. And we've spent a lot of time kind of digging deep into the Constitution, looking at what the framework was, how it was established, what are the powers of government, and all of that. And then we looked at kind of how these different institutions, these branches of government, actually function and operate, looking at it over time, and then also in terms of its mission, lawmaking, enforcing the law, interpreting the law, things of that nature. Here, I think it'd probably be good to kind of take a step back and say, what is this all for? Is this whole, some people call it kind of like a mouse trap, kind of a mechanism. And the Constitution was designed by people in the late 18th century who were significantly influenced by the Enlightenment, and this idea that you could take human reason, human rationality, put it to use, and for the betterment of mankind. And I think our constitutional structure, the whole idea of writing down the roles and responsibilities of government, kind of the do's and the don'ts. First of all, it suggests that there's certain limitations that we want on government. There's also a notion that there's a balance between what the government can do and what individuals can do in terms of their rights. And you can really get back into like what the purpose of government is at its essence, which is at least according to Jefferson in the Declaration, is to protect inalienable rights of life, liberty, property, and maybe some others. Okay, so this idea that a republic is being established with some very strict controls on government in order to produce a good society. And if you think about that preamble, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, a union of states, in order to establish justice, secure tranquility, which would be a kind of another way of saying happiness, defense, welfare, for the betterment of the society. So that's kind of those are the goals of the Constitution. That's the goals of civil society. And so when we move away from government and look at non-governmental political institutions, the first thing that jumps out at you is, how can the people, we the people, what's our role in making sure that this government does what it wants? So there's kind of a balancing between what the government can do and then what the people's rights are and what do the people want out of government. Okay, and so political parties kind of loom large there because it was about the same time that we were establishing our Constitution and our representative democracy that kind of modern political parties were being kind of formed. And really the place to look to, particularly for our experience, is Great Britain. So Great Britain had a longer experience with representative systems, with the parliament, as a check and a balance on the monarchy. And so as a result, there had been certain, and for lack of a better word, I would call them factions or coalitions within Parliament that kind of broke down roughly. You had a group of parliamentarians, legislators that were kind of loyal to the crown. Those were called Tories. And then you had those who were suspicious of executive power and also suspicious of the power that was growing in London. And so these were called Whigs, and their center of gravity, they wanted to kind of assert the power of Parliament vis-a-vis the crown, and their kind of center of gravity, their home base, as you say, was not in London, which was, you know, the most densely populated city in Europe, but it was in the countryside. And so there was this kind of cleavage between Tory, Whig, executive, legislative, city, country, or someone would say court, you know, because that's where the court of the crown met. So these political parties became, you know, they started out as kind of clubs, and then they gained more and more kind of coherence, and then they ended up kind of starting to form their own institutions, essentially, and then they. And you know, and we should kind of back up a little bit. You know, what's an institution? It's a set of procedures, people, programs that are established in order to pursue a common goal. And so that's what a political party is. It's an institution. It has procedures, it has policies, it has people, and it has goals. Okay, and so that kind of party building that was happening in England at the time kind of spilled out into the American experience. And so, you know, when we were fighting our war for independence, you know, people who are loyal to the crown were referred to as Tories. Now, in the American context, it's not so much about crown parliament. It's more about, do you want to stay loyal to Great Britain, or do you want to stay loyal, or do you want to maintain or create independence for the United States? And so the people who were more Whiggish, right, they were called patriots. So you had Tories, or sometimes they were called loyalists, but also patriots. Okay, so those were the kind of the beginnings of these types of factions. So anyway, we start with political parties because political parties was kind of an organic development in representative systems, starting in Great Britain, and then they become really, you know, we take it, the United States, and adopt that kind of model. So that's why we start with it. And here are some, so it's to kind of introduce the topic, here are some big questions that I want us to ponder as we talk about political parties. Let's see here. Okay, we're doing pretty good. How do political parties affect who is sovereign? Right? And so in America, we tend to say that the people are sovereign. Okay? How do political parties affect who governs, who makes decisions? Right? So on the one hand, the people are sovereign, but in a representative system, we say that the people who are elected by the people or appointed by the people, indirectly or directly, they make the decisions for us, right? Those are our representatives. And so how do parties affect who is sovereign, who governs, and then who is accountable? Who is accountable to who? So political parties have a role to play in each of those, all right? Here's another big one. Why do political parties exist in the first place? What roles do they play, right? What roles ought they to play in our political system? And then finally, here's another big question. Can a republic function without viable, vibrant, and valid political parties? And one of the reasons why we want to keep an eye on that question is that depending on what dimension you look at in terms of political parties, it's fair to say that their impact on the day-to-day lives of American citizens is probably at its lowest point, probably in our history. We'll talk more about that as we proceed with the topic. But on one hand, political parties really, when you look at it over time from an historical perspective, play very little day-to-day roles in how people live their lives. That was not always the case, but it is now. And so, with political parties not really having much of an impact on how people live, can the roles and functions that they have played over time, can they be performed by other actors? Are what they do even important? Again, it begs the question, are they needed? Do we need political parties in order to run a representative democracy? And if we do, and they are weak, and they're in decline, and they're not doing what we want them to do, then how would we go about maybe fixing that situation? And is the problem a problem among the American people? Is it a problem with the political parties themselves? And so that's a question that we'll have to kind of consider. So again, how do political parties affect sovereignty, governance, and accountability? What is the goals? What do political parties, why do they exist in the first place? What role should they play? And can a republic like ours function without them? Okay, so I want you to consider those as we move forward. Another kind of introductory, kind of almost like a prism that we're going to view political parties through is what I would call the three dimensions of political parties. So when you look at American politics, and again, civics, this course is about trying to understand our political system. You can look at how political parties how they function from three different perspectives or dimensions or vantage points. The first one is political parties as they operate within the electorate. And what I mean by the electorate are voters. So, it's hard to have a republic without elections. That's the whole accountability piece. And, by the way, just to kind of put a finer point to it, we believe as Americans, I think, that republics do a better job of governing people. And what's the purpose of government is to provide justice, right? And to provide happiness, flourishing, in the way that Aristotle would define that term. So we believe that a system of representation and consent, periodic elections to provide accountability, that ends up creating a better society than maybe a monarchy, right? Even a limited constitutional monarchy like the one that Great Britain has, or a theocracy, or a dictatorship, or maybe a direct democracy, maybe having, the people themselves not only have power, but also make the day-to-day decisions, right? So you can kind of go more democratic or even less democratic, depending upon the circumstance. Should a political party like the Communist Party of China, should they govern the society because they're going to make it better for their people? These are debates that all around the world that we can talk about. Okay, so we believe that republics function better, right? But a key component of that is voting, and so political parties, for a long, long time, have helped voters make decisions about who to vote for. Okay, so we're going to look at voter identification, party identification. How do people in the United States, do they identify, do they connect with, do they even belong to a political party? And then we're also going to talk about from the whole idea of the electorate, how have parties fared in creating what I would call coalitions, groupings of people that maybe have something in common with each other, but maybe not exactly all in common with them. And so sometimes what we look at political parties, they are coalitions between different groupings or subgroupings within the electorate. Okay, so that's one way, that's one dimension of political parties, party in the electorate. The second dimension that we'll study is party as its own organization or its own institution. So it's one thing to say that Rich Brake is a libertarian, because that's my party identification maybe, and so those principles that the Libertarian Party stands for are closer to what I believe, and therefore I'm going to vote that way in elections. And maybe the Libertarian Party is part, or people who identify with as a libertarian might be part of a broader coalition. Okay, so that might be, or maybe we have our own political party, or whatever, right? So so the organization is about, okay, how have they, how has the Libertarian Party created a structure? Who runs the Libertarian Party? Do they have chapters? Do they have clubs? Do they have them? Are they organized by city, by county, by state, by nationality, women, men, whatever? Okay, so we're going to look at party as an organization. What are their goals? What is their structure? And what are their functions? Okay, so if you think about St. Michael Academy, what is our goal? Our goal is to create, the next generation of Catholic leaders in the country. How are we structured? We have a curriculum. We have teachers. We teach a certain way. We have faith formation, right? And then our functions are, what are our outputs? We create classes. We give grades. We have sports. We do clubs, right? That's our institution. So we're going to look at parties in the same way as an organization and how they are created and what they do. Finally, the last dimension we'll look at is party in the government. Okay, so you have people outside in the electorate that identify with a political party. You have the political party itself that's trying to interact with people in the electorate, but they're also interacting with people in government. And just to kind of cut to the chase, one of the primary goals of a political party is to capture the government, right? To take it over, to run it, to produce policies that are in keeping with what they believe in, right? So that's really their goal. Now, that might sound kind of, I don't know, harsh, I guess, but they really want to take over the government. That's the reason why they exist. Now, take over, what's that mean? Now, one of the blessings that we have as Americans is that takeover process, that fight over who controls the government, we do it with ballots and not bullets. And so we have this tradition, which is a beautiful tradition, of the peaceful transfer of power from one grouping that wants to control the government, maybe to another. Okay, so we take that for granted. Now, there have been some instances in our history where you couldn't take that for granted. At the time of our founding, there were large factions, large coalitions that did not want to declare independence and fought against, like on the battlefield against. So we're talking about serious business. Remember, as a percentage of the population, there were more deaths in the Revolutionary War for Americans than any other war in our history. Of course, the second one is the Civil War. That was another war that we fought essentially with each other. Okay, so that was another time when we did not peacefully transfer power. And the whole swaths of the country just basically said, we don't want to be a part of the United States of America anymore. And then you look in the 20th century, you could look at the Civil Rights Movement as a real kind of a question about whether people wanted to stay or go because of the way certain states were treating their citizens. And, not to maybe be too grandiose or dramatic, but it's possible that there are people today that are thinking significantly about whether they want to stay or go, because depending upon who sits in the White House. So every so often you get situations where we don't transfer power peacefully, but most of the time we do. But the parties, they are set up to capture the government, to take it over. But hopefully we do it peacefully. Okay. So when you look at the party in the government, You can look at how they organize political institutions. We saw that kind of already with Congress. Think about those party leadership positions: Speaker of the House, Whip, caucus chairs. Of course, they also party leadership by organizing Congress also determines who controls committee chairmanships and things of that nature. They control the flow of legislation. They bargain and strike deals. I just saw in the newspaper that the second round of the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, has been passed in the Senate, and so this is a second round of aid to small businesses during this time of closure. And so there was a deal struck between Republicans who wanted more money for small business, and Democrats in Congress who wanted more money for hospitals and state and local government. So those are two political parties organizing themselves within Congress, and also, of course, the White House. The political party organizes the White House as well. And if we looked at the court, think about those coalitions that were around the case, like with an abortion case or something like that. So political appointments to the Supreme Court also have a partisan flavor to them. We talked about packing the court. Well, how are you packing the court? You're packing the court with people who share your political and judicial philosophy, and partisanship has a lot to do with that. Okay, so those are kind of that's the dimensions that we're going to be looking at. Okay. Next topic, as kind of a setup, and by the way, so what we're going to be doing after this lecture is we're going to be looking at each of those dimensions sequentially. We're going to look at party in the electorate, party as an organization, and party in the government. Okay, so that's kind of how we'll organize our lectures moving forward. Before we begin, too, I want to talk about that actually, when you look at the world, we're not the only country that has political parties. We were one of the first to have them, for sure. But American-style political parties, in a lot of ways, are different. They're very unique when you look at it from a comparative perspective. And there are certain reasons for that. So let me just go over a few of them for you. Number one, we have a two-party system. A lot of countries have more than just two political parties. Now, part of that, there's reasons for that. So one would be, I think we kind of took our cue from Great Britain, and for whatever reason, Great Britain's parties really coalesced around this kind of court-country distinction, crown-parliament distinction, okay? And then later, as they developed, you ended up getting issues of class, right? So the people who were wealthy, people who owned property, versus maybe the laboring classes. And so actually, right now, the two major parties in Great Britain are the Tories, kind of what we would call maybe the Conservative Party, although those labels sometimes are a little confusing. And then the Labour Party would be like your Liberal Party, in the way Americans would say it, maybe Progressive Party, the party of the working man, so to speak. Now, some of those characterizations actually are less valid than they were maybe 30, 40 years ago, but they kind of hold still, I think, for some. And actually, it's interesting, in Great Britain, there's a third party that's actually had some staying power, and it's called the Liberal Party. Now, in Great Britain, the Liberal Party would be actually more like our moderates. We don't really have a moderate party because we don't have a two-party system, but we have moderates in both, and I think in both parties, and so they have to make a decision on where they kind of land, election to election, candidate to candidate. But anyway, so some of it is because we come from Great Britain and there was a history of two parties. Another reason, I think, is that early on in our history, some of the biggest early debates about politics were centered around like dominant personal character, like personalities, and it was kind of like this guy versus that guy. So at the beginning of our country's history, the two biggest kind of partisans were Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, and the people who kind of agreed with Hamilton and his view of politics kind of coalesced around him, and then people who were a little bit more in tune with what Thomas Jefferson was having to sell, they kind of coalesced around him. So the first political parties, in this case Hamiltonian Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans, were kind of centered around the personalities, not just personalities, but there was personalities involved, but also their ideas about what government should or should not do, and we call those sometimes ideologies. So there's kind of a bipolarity, I would say, between a tradition there in the United States. Some of it's structural too. Our two-party system. Unlike a lot of countries, we have a system where, particularly like Congress, state legislators, city councils, they tend to represent districts. And in a district, and a district would be just kind of like a territory. So if you think about, who is it, Jack McKinnon? I can't remember, maybe I got that wrong. He's the member of Congress in northern Michigan. That's his district, and it includes Emmett County and Charlevoix County, but it also goes up into the Upper Peninsula. That's his district. Well, in Europe, it's possible, like if they had a district there, you could have more than one person represent that district. We call that a multi-member district. In the United States, it's not that way. We usually have single-member districts. Now, there's a bit of variation there. Like in the case I actually taught in colleges in New Jersey. In the state legislature in New Jersey, actually the House, this New Jersey House of Representatives, they have, I think it's 40 legislative districts, and there's two representatives from each district. So they actually have a multi-member district. Some counties, actually, when you elect people, you elect them on a county-wide basis. And so like in Pennsylvania, county commissioners, there are 4 people run, and the top 3 vote getters get in. So it almost guarantees, with our two-party system, at least one of them will be from the rival political party. So there's this desire to actually have some partisan balance on some of these local offices. Okay, but by and large, we are a single-member district system, and that actually, so if there's really, you don't get a lot for second place. The other structural issue is that we have a winner-take-all system in almost all elections. So like in a lot of European parliamentary systems, and Mark Moncluse would be able to probably talk about this, depending upon the laws and the offices that you're seeking, sometimes what they'll do is that individuals will run for offices, and sometimes it's more than one person representing a district, but then they'll take a look at all they'll say, okay, how many people in Spain voted for, I don't know, the socialist candidate, okay? And so and if you got above a certain threshold of voters pushing the lever for socialist candidates, that would guarantee a certain percentage of socialist candidates in the parliament, or the Cortes, or whatever Spain calls their legislature. So that's what we would mean by proportional voting, as opposed to winner-take-all voting. In America, one seat, one district, one representative, and who gets it? The person who gets the most votes. One more vote, you win the whole seat. Okay, so it's a winner-take-all system, and that also encourages two political parties. There's also some theory and some arguments that would say that because the two political parties had kind of a foothold onto our system, and have had a long time, especially now with the Republicans and Democrats, that they have functioned almost like a cartel. And so who ends up actually making the rules for how elections are run? It's the legislatures in the different states, but who are state legislators and members of Congress? They are members of a political party. So the only thing that Democrats hate more than Republicans, and Republicans hate more than Democrats, is any other political party getting into the act, so to speak. So they actually create rules and laws that make it very difficult for third parties to actually gain access to the ballot. So ballot access becomes a big issue. You gotta always collect enough signatures. Well, a lot of the major political parties, they set thresholds to say, well, if your candidate in the last election for Senate got over 30% of the vote, then your candidate ought, for the next election, next cycle, gets on the ballot automatically without having to collect signatures. Now, 30% for the Republicans and Democrats, you can just roll out of bed and get on the ballot with that in most cases. That doesn't mean you're going to win. But if you're a third party, let's say a Libertarian or the Green Party or something like that, getting 30% of an election is very, very difficult. And that makes it very, so the only other way that they can get on the ballot is to collect signatures every time, which requires money, resources, personnel, all that kind of stuff. And they don't have it. So in some ways, there's kind of the system in some ways is rigged toward the two parties. What are some other? So that's one of the reasons why we have a two-party system. Now, another feature of our political parties is that they're federal in nature. So we don't just have one Republican Party or one Democratic Party. We have how many? Well, at least 50, because we have Republican and Democratic parties and Libertarian parties and Socialist parties by state. And then how about within a state? You have the Republican and Democratic Party of Emmett County, but you also have them in Charlevoix County and Macomb County down near Detroit, and Chester County where I am right now. So they'll have political parties. And then sometimes you have not just county organizations, but you have city political parties. The Democratic Party of Philadelphia, the Republican Party of Grand Rapids, so on and so forth. So it's a federal structure, and it's almost like a pyramid, and it works its way up. So you have city or municipal parties, county parties, state parties, national parties. And the two national parties for the two major parties is the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee. Let's see, anything else? I would say our political parties tend to be more focused on winning elections than being ideologically or principled, in the sense that if I need to kind of fudge where I am on a particular issue, and if that means I'm allowed to actually maybe have a better chance at winning the election, our political parties tend to be more candidate-centered as opposed to party-centered. And so there's a lot of people who are running for office that call themselves a Democrat or a Republican, but they kind of vary in terms of where they stand on particular issues. Now, as we're going to see later on with party in the government, of people who are in government, these party identifications are becoming much more polarized, in the sense that there's a lot less kind of mixing and matching that goes on. There's a lot fewer moderate Republicans, and there's a lot fewer conservative Democrats. But with that said, it's still the case that it's often up to the individual candidate to make a decision about where they stand on the issue, as opposed to maybe listening to a political party chairman or something like that. So it's more about winning office than it is about being principled or ideologically pure. Okay? Last thing I would say about American-style political parties and their uniqueness is that we have a separation of powers system. We talked about the federal system in terms of local, state, federal, or national. But in terms of separation of powers, in parliamentary systems, if you win the parliament, a majority in the parliament, and usually what happens is that there's a lot of bargaining and coalition building that happens after the election in a parliamentary system. Because what they're trying to do is create a majority. I saw in the paper that the Israeli Knesset, which is their parliament, they just decided on having Netanyahu be the prime minister this year, but then in a power sharing arrangement, I think his name is Gantz, Freddie Gantz, who is more of the Liberal Party, is going to have the prime minister next year because it was so close. So that kind of bargaining happens after the election. And after that, the parliament then creates the executive branch. So there's no separation in a parliamentary system. It's a kind of a unity of power. And so if you have political parties, that affects their role and their power. In our system, you can have one party control the House, one party control the Senate, which we do, another part, a different party control the White House, and then you can replicate that kind of situation, in at the state by state level, where I think in Pennsylvania the Democrats control the governor, but the House and the Senate are controlled by the Republican Party. So there's conflict there. Okay. Um, okay. So let's do a quick. Let's see. I've got about 10 more minutes left, and this might bleed into the next class, but I want to start with kind of and we've done this already a little bit, because if you remember when we were talking about the presidency, that one of the ways that presidential authority varied was because if they were coming into power when their party was on the rise or on the descent. Okay, so we talked about party systems, and we talked about realignment. And we said that there were these critical elections that occurred every so often where one party who had been the majority party and then becomes the minority party, and so on. So we've talked a little bit about history of political parties here. What I'm going to try to do in this, and again, it's necessarily short, is to kind of go through some how what the breakdown was by political party, and kind of what did these political parties stand for. And we'll return to this over and over again, especially when we're talking about, how does a voter determine whether he's a Republican or Democrat? Well, where do they stand? Where do the parties stand on the particular issues? And where does that candidate who identifies as a Republican or a Democrat, where do they stand on the political issues? Okay. But anyway, so I'll just start in, and we'll just see how far we can get in about 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So first thing I would say is that there's always been, because we have a two-party system, there's always been a party that I think has been recognized, fairly or not, as the elite party. The party of kind of property, and there's always this class issue that comes with political parties. Whereas another party has been kind of viewed by the people, and maybe by themselves as well, as the more populist party, the party of kind of the little guy. All right, so that dimension has always been part of American party politics, and I would say that often when you see shifts from one party gaining control or majority or minority, it's when certain parts of that coalition believe that the people running the party aren't for the little guy, for example. And I think in the case of what's going on with Trump, there is kind of, he is going after parts of the Democratic coalition that had long been part of labor Democrats. But there's a lot of rank and file members of particularly trade unions, not government unions, but private sector unions, that are coming around to maybe voting for somebody like a Trump, who is a very different kind of Republican than, let's say, a George W. Bush Republican. So elite versus populism. I would also say that as coalitions, there have been shifts in the coalition over time. And so the difference between a party being in the majority or in the minority usually doesn't mean that, you have this massive switch of like 30 or 40% of the electorate deciding, I'm not a Republican anymore, I'm a Democrat. Especially today, when most people have very weak party allegiances to begin with. But it takes about maybe 5% of the electorate, 10% of the electorate, 6% of the electorate to make a shift. And so we have a big tent political party system where these coalitions, they kind of shift, and the lines kind of go back and forth over time. I would also say that there's kind of a national versus state party cleavage. So if you, let's say, take the Federalists, for example, the first political party, they tended to be the party of a strong national government, where the Jeffersonian Republicans were uncomfortable with a strong national government. They were more anti-federalist, and they wanted more power at the state and local level. So you can see that today. I would argue that probably the Republican Party today is the more like local, state, and local party, whereas the Democratic Party is the more national party. But that depends. Sometimes politics makes strange bedfellows, and sometimes you'll see Republicans making national arguments. Trump does it. Trump's all over the map when it comes to this kind of stuff. Being consistent is not one of his virtues. You also have a cleavage between a party that would be considered the party of more activist government or larger government. Usually, they would argue that it's to help people, that you actually need to use the power of government to assist people living their lives. And then you have a party that tends to be more the party that looks at government as a problem and not the solution. And so they would be the advocates of smaller or limited government. And so I think if you looked at the parties today, I would say that the Democratic Party is the party of more of an activist, larger government. Although again, issue by issue, it's very different. Like in case of abortion, you've got Republicans who want stronger government to maybe protect the lives of the unborn, whereas Democrats might say no, we should allow individual rights to take that. So it really depends sometimes on the issue. We've also had in our country's history a lot of regional cleavages, right? So the South, the Northeast. We were talking about who was going to open up the government. Well, it looks like a lot of people in the South want to open up open up businesses, and then people in the Northeast are a little bit more reticent. Now, maybe that's because of the Northeast is more densely populated, the South is less so. But you know what? Issues about how crowded a place that you live versus maybe living in a more rural setting, that also I think affects the way you view government. And so it's not surprising, in other words, that you would have these differences of opinion. Think about guns. A handgun in New York City it looks very different than a hunting rifle in Michigan. Okay. So then you also have so basically south, northeast, far west. You also have community cleavages. So this would be something like urban versus rural versus suburban, and so you have different partisan cleavages when it comes to that. And then finally, I would say before we get into kind of a quick history of who the political parties were and what they stood for. One of the big fundamental questions, one more thing, race, class, gender. So that also affects what your party allegiances are. We have a gender gap in American politics today where men more or less trend more toward being Republican, and women trend to be more toward the Democrats, and there's reasons we could discuss about why that is. How about race? 80 to 90% of African Americans are Democrats. I would say probably 60% of whites are Republican. Okay, so those are some significant differences. How about class? It used to be the poorer you were, the more likely you were kind of the party of the little guy. In this case, it might be for the Democrats. Now, I think if you're really, really poor, that's still the case. But working class, working poor, that they have actually, this is where some of the shift is occurring. They're more and more likely to actually vote for a Republican than they ever were. And then those who are super, super rich, and we're talking about million and billionaires, something very interesting has been occurring over the last 20 to 30 years. They've been shifting a little bit more toward the Democrats, which would never have been the case, let's say, in 1900. Most millionaires at that time were Republicans. Now, and I think some of it has to do with the fact that income is correlated with education. I think education, especially more and more education, we tend to be correlated with being more liberal or progressive on particular issues. So there's some trends along those lines, and then the broad middle class. That's where you have a lot of competition, but the Republican Party tends to be the party of the middle and upper middle class. And so class ends up being an issue as well. And then race, Latino, white, Asian, those are also factors as well. But finally, I think one fundamental question that really affects what political parties profess to believe in, and what people who want to be a part of a political party would want to say that they are, is what is the proper role of government in American society? And so political parties are going to have answers to those particular type of questions. All right, I'm going to go 5 more minutes and then I'll stop. So we looked at the first political party system were Hamiltonian Federalists versus Jeffersonian Republicans. This lasted from about 1788 to 1824. The Federalists were the nationalist party. They wanted a stronger national government. They were in favor of the new Constitution. The Jeffersonian, they were concentrated in cities. They were particularly strong in the North, although there were Federalists in the South. Jeffersonian Republicans, these were more rural voters. These were people who wanted more states' rights. There was trade differences. The Jeffersonians wanted free trade. Hamilton talked about tariffs. So those were some of the big differences that kind of characterized that political party system. And it was also elite politics. There was many states had restrictions on voting. You had to own property to vote in a lot of places, and also to hold office, you had to own property. But as those voting restrictions started to become loosened by the 1820s and 1830s, you had this new era called Jacksonian democracy. And with it came a new political party. The Federalists kind of died out, although some of their ideas kept up. The Jeffersonian Republicans kind of morphed into this new political party called the Jacksonians. And the Jacksonians were kind of the heirs to the Jeffersonian legacy, but they also, because they were appealing now to people without property, they kind of shifted particularly on tax issues and also expansion. Of course, the whole issue of slavery. Southern Democrats did not want to restrict slavery anywhere. Northern Democrats actually a little bit more so. So, a lot of these parties were national in origin, although they had regional flavors and regional centers of power. Eventually, a new political party emerges to kind of rival the Jacksonian Democrats, and these are what we call the Whig Party, and their big spokesman was Henry Clay. And Henry Clay was kind of he's the heir of the Hamiltonian vision for the country. So he was for higher tariffs. He was for what we call internal improvements. So using the national government, to build roads, bridges, to connect the different parts of the growing country together. He was for a more kind of robust or a more limited role for the American government abroad, so more the Democrats, actually, it's kind of interesting that's been a flip-flop. The Democrats during this period were much more of the expansionist party. They wanted the American government to expand all over the place, west, south, whatever. Then you have a third-party system. So the Jacksonian system lasted from about 1828 to 1860. And then the third system is what I would call Lincoln Republicans. And this was about slavery, obviously, but a new party, the Whigs, die out, and then some Northern Democrats move over to this new Republican Party, and they used the name because they were also trying to connect with some aspects of the Jeffersonian legacy. But the Republicans were Whiggish and Hamiltonian. Lincoln was a Whig before he was a Republican. He wanted a protective tariff. They were also the party of cities and industry. And so Democrats were much more of the rural agricultural party. And so, the Civil War was fought. The Democrats had a very strong basis in the South, but they seceded. And so for a long time, the Republican Party was really the only game in town. There were Northern Democrats, but they didn't have their Southern allies, and so they had a hard time winning elections until Reconstruction was over. But when Reconstruction ends in 1876, the Democrats are kind of reborn in a different type of coalition, and their kind of their big spokesperson by the late end of this period was that it lasted really until 1892 was Grover Cleveland. He was from New York, and he was for civil service reform. So there's this big arguments about he was a free trader, and he wanted to actually limit some power of parties to control patronage. And we'll talk about patronage tomorrow. Then you get a situation where the Republicans and Democrats are still there, but the nature of their coalition changes. And so McKinley is elected in 1896. This is a critical election where he's able to convince some Democrats to come over to his side. William Jennings Bryan was a populist. The Democrats co-endorse him. He's from the Midwest, I think from Nebraska. It's a Midwest, Great Plains South party, and they get whacked. They get shellacked. But the same states that voted for Trump, for example, in 2016 are the same states that voted for William Jennings Bryan as a Democrat in 1896. In 1896, Bryan lost. In 2016, Trump won. And he's called himself a Republican, but he actually has a fair amount of commonality with some of William Jennings Bryan, but he also has a lot in common with William McKinley, particularly in his preference for tariffs. Then you have kind of an interlude, I would argue. It's a short-lived, progressive kind of moment in American politics where Teddy Roosevelt he called himself a Republican, but I think he was more like a progressive. But it was a kind of a Republican-flavored progressivism. And then Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat who also is kind of the Democrat flavor of progressivism. And this period lasts really from about 1908 to 1920. It didn't. They were calling themselves Republicans and Democrats, but they had a very different kind of way of going about governing. There was kind of a reform element to all of it, and we'll talk more about this later. These are just broad brushstrokes. Next system would be this is the famous New Deal coalition of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That's one of the classic critical elections in American history where the Democrats become the majority party. The Republicans, in different forms, have controlled national politics really from 1860 to 1932. That's a long run, but the Democrats kind of take over things and really run the government, I think, until the 1980s and early 1990s. And so it's FDR's New Deal Democrats, and then I would say that really the person that kind of personifies Republicanism is Robert Taft, and he is the senator and governor of Ohio. He's the one, if you see this thing here, I like Ike, he ran against Ike in 1952 for the Republican nomination, and most people thought he was going to win. He's a very different type of Republican than Eisenhower. In fact, in that case, Eisenhower was actually asked by both the Republicans and Democrats to be their standard bearer. So that gives you an idea about what kind of politician he was. That coalition, that party cleavage really lasted until 1976. The Republicans were against big government. They were against portions of the welfare state that FDR had put into place. They were the state and local party against the expansion of the national government under the Democrats. And you had the Great Society under Lyndon Baines, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. So this is all this civil rights going on, lots of stuff. But that New Deal coalition starts to break down by the late 1970s, and by 1980. You get what I would call the Reagan Revolution. So that's this guy right here, and so you get a much more kind of conservative, and again that's a label, and I can explain that later. A conservative style of republicanism, and then the Democrats really become much more liberal. Although I think that really their standard bearer was somebody who had seen some of the excesses of liberalism. His name was Bill Clinton. And he ends up kind of triangulating and taking certain portions of republicanism and making, he was the one that coined the phrase, the era of big government is over. He said that in his acceptance speech in 1996. And then today, and so I would argue that this kind of Reagan, Republican, Clinton, Democrat, of course the Bushes are part of this story, and there's George Herbert Walker Bush ran against Reagan and called him extreme, and he called this brand of economics voodoo economics. So the Bushes and the Reaganites really don't get along actually very well. But his son George W. Bush actually took portions of Reagan because it was so popular among his party. But now you really have, I think, a very unsettled party situation where you've got, I would call them Obama Democrats, who are much more progressive. I would almost say, in some respects, they're flirting with social democracy or democratic socialism. It's interesting, somebody like Bernie Sanders, who's running for the Democratic nomination, is not himself a Democrat. He calls himself a socialist. And then you have these Trump Republicans. What are they? They're a very different beast. They're not Reagan Republicans to some degree. They're not really. I would say it's kind of a cross between McKinley and some Taft, and maybe even some Jackson. So he's an interesting character in terms of where he fits. And one of the big questions will be, will his brand of republicanism die with him because of his strong, abrasive personality, or will some of his policy positions, let's say on immigration or on trade, or really even on entitlements? He is not somebody who wants to cut Social Security. Now, I think he'll probably be against Medicare for all, but he certainly is. He would not be for cutting Medicare for the elderly. That he's come out on that. So he's kind of a big government Republican to some degree. So anyway, he's an interesting beast, and of course the Democratic Party, in the way that it's flirting with certain aspects of socialism, also indicates that there's really flux in the American party system. So that's I know I went a little bit long, but I wanted to kind of set the stage and set the table, so to speak, for our more detailed conversations tomorrow and on Monday, where we will really get into the nuts and bolts and the mechanics of the party and the electorate, party as an organization, and party in the government. Okay, so that's it for now. So I will create a Google Forms assignment for this. You're still working on your brief, and so that will be due on Monday, but I'll ask you to do these homework assignments as well. Okay? Thank you very much.